The empty chairs stared back at me like accusers. Rows and rows of white folding chairs, each one decorated with a single white rose tied with lavender ribbon, each one paid for, each one waiting for someone who would never come. I stood in my wedding dress at the back of the garden venue, clutching my phone so tight my knuckles had gone white, staring at the sea of vacant seats that should have held my friends, my family, my entire world. The string quartet I'd hired played softly near the altar, their music drifting through the evening air like a lullaby for ghosts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My wedding planner, Janet, hovered nearby with that practiced smile. Event coordinator's perfect when everything is falling apart. The photographer had stopped taking pictures of the empty ceremony space, and was now documenting the flowers instead, probably trying to salvage something from this disaster for his portfolio. I should introduce myself properly. My name is Sarah Chen, and this was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. 3 years of planning, $47,000 of my savings, and a credit card I'd maxed out to make everything perfect. I'd sent save the dates 18 months ago, formal invitations 6 months ago, and had been confirming details with guests right up until last week. Every single person had said yes. Every single person had promised to be here. Not one of them showed up. The morning started like any bride's dream. I woke up in the bridal suite at the Magnolia Gardens Inn, sunlight streaming through gauze curtains, the smell of jasmine drifting in from the garden below. My maid of honor, Jessica, was supposed to be there with mimosas and terrible reality TV to calm my nerves. Instead, I woke up to a text message that would haunt me for months. Sarah, I'm so sorry. Emergency with mom, can't make it, no you'll understand. We'll make it up to you, no phone call, no explanation of what kind of emergency. Just 16 words that crushed 3 years of friendship into digital dust. Jessica had been my roommate in college, my confidant through 2 breakups, the person who held my hair back when I had food poisoning junior year. She was supposed to help me into my dress, fix my veil, tell me I looked beautiful. Instead, I stared at her text while sitting alone on Egyptian cotton sheets that cost more per night than I usually spent on groceries in a week. I called her immediately, straight to voicemail. The generic message she'd never bothered to personalize. I hung up and tried again. Same result. A cold knot formed in my stomach, but I pushed it down. Emergencies happen. Real friends understand. I'd get ready alone, take some selfies, and Jessica would feel terrible when she realized what she'd missed. The hair and makeup team arrived at 8 sharp. 2 cheerful women named Brandy and Michelle, who chatted about reality TV while they worked magic on my face and turned my straight black hair into something that belonged in a fairy tale. They didn't ask about the missing maid of honor, probably assuming she'd arrive later. I didn't tell them she wouldn't be coming. Speaking it out loud would make it real. By 10 a.m., I looked like a different person, the kind of bride you see in magazines, the kind who has her life together and makes getting married look effortless. My dress was a vintage-inspired A-line with delicate lace sleeves and tiny pearl buttons that ran from the neckline to the small of my back. It had taken me 8 months to find, trying on what felt like hundreds of dresses in tiny boutiques and department stores. When I finally found this one hanging in a small shop in Portland, I'd actually cried in the fitting room. Not pretty tears either, ugly sobbing tears that the sales associate pretended not to notice. My phone buzzed. A text from my cousin Rachel, who was supposed to be doing a reading during the ceremony. Food poisoning. Dying. So sorry. Rain check. Rain check. On my wedding. Like it was a casual coffee date we could reschedule when it was more convenient. I stared at the message, reading it 3 times before it sank in. Rachel, who I'd grown up with, who knew how much this day meant to me, was backing out with a 2-line text message. I called her too, also straight to voicemail. The knot in my stomach tightened. The 3rd text arrived while I was touching up my lipstick. My college friend Marcus, who'd promised to bring his girlfriend and had requested the vegetarian meal option just 2 weeks ago. Hey Sarah, something came up. Can't make it today. Congratulations though. Something came up. Congratulations though. like he was declining a casual invitation to a barbecue. I sat down hard on the antique vanity chair, my dress pooling around me like spilled milk. 3 people. 3 important people who'd all mysteriously developed emergencies or mysterious obligations on the exact same day. My hands shook as I called my mom. She lived in Sacramento, a 4-hour drive away, but she'd promised to arrive early to help me get ready. The phone rang 6 times before she answered, and I could hear traffic in the background. Sarah, honey, I'm running late. There was an accident on the 5, traffic is completely stopped. I'm going to miss the ceremony, but I'll be there for the reception, I promise. An accident on the 5. Traffic. My mother, who had raised me to believe that you moved heaven and earth to be there for the people you love, was going to miss my wedding ceremony because of traffic. I wanted to scream, to demand she get out of her car and find another way, to remind her that I'd paid for her hotel room and her dress, and the shoes she'd bought specifically for this day. Instead, I heard myself say okay, that I understood, that these things happen. You look beautiful, sweetheart. I saw the pictures you sent this morning. I'm so proud of you. She hung up, and I realized she'd managed to make her missing my wedding about her being proud of me. Even my devastation was being reframed as her maternal satisfaction. The texts kept coming. My college roommate Linda. My work friend Amanda. My neighbor Kevin, who'd helped me move furniture and had become an unexpected friend over shared takeout dinners. Each message was a variation on the same theme. Emergency. Sorry, can't make it. Congratulations. Generic. Distant. Like they were declining LinkedIn invitations. By noon, I'd received 17 cancellations. 17 people who'd confirmed, who I'd arranged seating for, who I'd paid for meals and favors and travel expenses for. My guest count had gone from 73 to 56 to 31 to 18. With each text, I felt a piece of my heart chip away. The worst part wasn't just that they weren't coming. It was how easy it seemed to be for them. How little effort they put into their excuses. How quickly they dismissed something that meant everything to me. I'd spent 3 years planning this day, saved every penny, worked extra shifts at the marketing firm, where I spent my days writing copy for products I didn't care about. I'd skipped vacations, eaten ramen for dinner more nights than I wanted to count, and said no to countless social events, because every dollar was earmarked for this wedding. I'd paid for flights for out-of-town guests. Hotel rooms for college friends, who couldn't afford them. I'd arranged transportation from the airport. Welcome bags filled with local treats and hangover remedies. Itineraries for the weekend, that included a rehearsal dinner at my favorite restaurant, and a day after brunch at a cafe by the river. I'd thought about every detail, every comfort, every way to make the people I loved feel appreciated and included. And they'd all decided, apparently overnight, that they had better things to do. My phone buzzed again. David, my would-be husband, texting from wherever he was getting ready with his groomsmen. Everything okay on your end? Getting excited. I stared at the message, wondering how to tell him that our wedding was turning into a disaster before it had even started. David was the kind of person who saw the best in everyone, who assumed good intentions and gave endless second chances. He'd probably say that emergencies happen, that the people who really matter will be there, that we should focus on celebrating our love instead of counting empty chairs. He wasn't wrong, exactly, but he also wasn't the one sitting in a wedding dress that cost 3 months of rent, watching his carefully planned celebration crumble in real time. I texted back that everything was fine, that I couldn't wait to see him at the altar. It wasn't exactly a lie. I did want to see him, to have at least one person in my life who'd shown up the way they promised they would. But fine was definitely not the word I'd use to describe my current situation. Janet, my wedding planner, knocked softly on the door, and entered with a clipboard, and that professional smile that was starting to look more forced by the hour. Sarah, honey, I hate to bother you, but I need to talk to you about the seating chart. We've had quite a few last-minute changes. Quite a few. Such a delicate way to describe the complete collapse of my guest list. How many are we down to? I asked, though I'd been counting along with each devastating text. Well, with the updates I've received this morning, We're looking at about 22 confirmed attendees. But don't worry, we can make adjustments. Move some tables, create a more intimate setting. Sometimes smaller weddings are actually more meaningful. 22 people, down from 73. I'd paid for a minimum of 50 meals at $95 per plate. The math was simple and brutal. I was paying for 28 dinners that would go uneaten, for place settings that would remain untouched, for centerpieces that would decorate empty tables. What about David's side? I asked, clinging to hope that maybe his friends and family were more reliable than mine. Janet consulted her clipboard, and I saw something flicker across her face before the professional mask slipped back into place. His groomsmen are all here, and his immediate family. But we've had some cancellations there too. His cousin's family, a few college friends. His aunt and uncle, we're probably looking at about 15 from his side. 15. David came from a big Irish Catholic family, with what seemed like hundreds of cousins and family friends. At his sister's wedding 2 years ago, there had been nearly 200 people. I'd met some of them at various gatherings, barbecues, and birthday parties where I'd felt welcomed and included. They'd seemed genuinely excited about our wedding when we'd announced our engagement. Did they give reasons? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Various things. The flu seems to be going around. Work commitments. Family obligations. The flu, work commitments, family obligations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
All conveniently arising on the same weekend, for people who'd known about this date for over a year. I nodded and told Janet to do whatever she thought was best with the seating arrangements. She left, and I was alone again with my thoughts and my phone, which had mercifully stopped buzzing with new cancellations. I tried to rationalize it. People get sick, emergencies happen, work can be demanding and unpredictable. Family obligations are important, but the sheer volume of last-minute cancellations felt like more than bad luck. It felt intentional. It felt like I'd somehow misjudged every relationship in my life, mistaken politeness for genuine affection, confused convenience for commitment. Had I been that wrong about everyone? Had I built my entire social circle on a foundation of people who saw me as optional, as someone whose important moments could be skipped without consequence? I thought about my friendship with Jessica, 3 years of late-night phone calls and shared secrets and promises to be each other's maid of honor someday. I thought about my cousin Rachel, family barbecues and holiday celebrations, where she'd seemed genuinely happy to see me. I thought about Marcus, study sessions in college and staying in touch through career changes and moves across the country. Maybe I'd been trying too hard. Maybe I'd been the friend who always initiated plans, who always reached out first, who always made the effort. Maybe I'd been so focused on being the kind of friend I wanted to have that I'd failed to notice I wasn't receiving the same energy in return. Or maybe they'd all just realized, simultaneously, that they didn't actually like me that much. The thought hit me like a physical blow, and I had to sit down again. What if this wasn't about emergencies or bad luck? What if this was about me discovering that I wasn't as important to people as they were to me? What if I'd spent years building relationships with people who saw me as an acquaintance, while I'd been treating them like family? My phone buzzed one more time. A text from an unknown number. Sarah, this is Janet's assistant. She asked me to let you know that the string quartet is wondering about timing. Should they continue playing, or would you prefer to delay the start of the ceremony? I looked at the clock on my phone. 2:30. The ceremony was supposed to start at 3. In 30 minutes, I was supposed to walk down an aisle lined with people who loved me, toward a man who'd chosen to spend his life with me, surrounded by the joy and celebration of our community. Instead, I was going to walk down an aisle lined with empty chairs, toward a small group of people who'd either felt obligated to show up, or had nowhere better to be. I texted back that we should start on time, that the people who wanted to be there would be there, and the rest didn't matter. But as I said it, I realized I didn't believe it yet. The empty chairs did matter. The absence of people I'd loved and supported and celebrated with mattered. The casual way they'd dismissed something I'd poured my heart and savings into mattered. I stood up and looked at myself in the mirror one more time. The hair and makeup were still perfect. The dress still looked like something from a magazine. I still looked like a bride whose wedding was about to be everything she'd dreamed of. But I felt like someone whose entire understanding of her place in the world had just shifted beneath her feet. I felt like someone who'd just learned that she'd been playing a game where everyone else knew the rules except her. I picked up my bouquet, white peonies, and garden roses with trailing ribbons that had taken 3 consultations with the florist to get just right. I took a deep breath, tried to summon some excitement for marrying the man I loved, and prepared to walk into whatever was waiting for me. Because regardless of who showed up or didn't show up, I was getting married today. I was marrying David, who'd never let me down, who'd never made me feel optional or forgettable. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe loving one person who loved me back the same way would be enough to make up for discovering that everyone else in my life had been willing to let me down when it mattered most. I opened the door of the bridal suite and stepped into the hallway, my dress rustling softly against the hardwood floors. In the distance, I could hear the string quartet playing the processional music we'd chosen together, a piece by Pachelbel that had made me cry the first time I'd heard it. In a few minutes, I'd find out exactly who had decided I was worth showing up for. And maybe more importantly, I'd find out what it felt like to discover who my real family actually was. I walked down the hallway toward the garden, each step echoing in the silence that should have been filled with laughter and conversation from arriving guests. Through the tall windows, I could see the ceremony space spread out below, and my heart sank even further. The empty chairs looked even more stark from this angle, like white monuments to disappointment arranged in perfect rows. But then I saw something that made me stop walking altogether. There were people in some of those chairs, not many, but more than I'd expected based on Janet's count. I pressed my face closer to the glass, trying to make out who had actually shown up. David's immediate family was there, as expected. His parents in the front row, his sister Kate with her husband and 2 kids. His brother Michael, looking uncomfortable in his rental tux but present nonetheless. That was 7 people right there, which felt like a victory after the morning I'd had. Behind them sat a few people I didn't immediately recognize. An elderly couple holding hands, both dressed formally. A middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled back in an elegant bun. A young man about my age wearing a navy suit, sitting alone but looking content to be there. And then I saw her, Mrs. Rodriguez from the flower shop where I'd been buying arrangements for the past 2 years. She was sitting in the 3rd row, wearing a beautiful purple dress, her hair styled in perfect curls. Next to her was someone I recognized as Tom from the coffee shop where I stopped every morning before work. He was wearing what looked like his best shirt and tie, and he kept looking around with the kind of wonder people have when they're somewhere they've never been before. My chest tightened, but not with the same disappointment I'd been carrying all morning. This was something different, something I couldn't quite name yet. I continued down the stairs, and through another window, I spotted more unexpected faces. Maria, who cleaned the office building where I worked. We'd chatted countless times while she emptied trash cans and I worked late, sharing stories about our families and dreams over cups of coffee from the break room vending machine. She was sitting near the back, wearing a dress I'd never seen before, looking proud and happy. Next to her sat Jerry, the security guard from the same building. He always asked about my weekend plans and remembered details about my life that surprised me. Once, when I'd been having a particularly bad day after a fight with Jessica, he'd given me a pep talk that had made me cry in the elevator afterward, not from sadness, but from the unexpected kindness of it. There was Linda Chen, no relation despite sharing my last name, who ran the dry cleaning shop where I'd taken my wedding dress for its final alterations. She'd spent hours with me getting every detail perfect, refusing to charge me for the extra fittings when I'd lost weight from stress in the weeks leading up to the wedding. She'd even called me the night before, to make sure I had everything I needed for the morning. I realized I was crying, but these weren't the tears of devastation I'd been fighting all day. These were different tears, complicated ones that I didn't have words for yet. Janet appeared beside me, tablet in hand, and that professional smile that I was starting to understand masked a lot of genuine caring. "Sarah, are you ready? David and the officiant are in position, and the quartet is waiting for your cue. I wiped my eyes, careful not to smudge the makeup that had taken 2 hours to perfect. Janet, who are all those people? I mean, I recognize some of them, but I didn't invite half the people I'm seeing in those chairs. Her smile shifted into something more genuine, almost maternal. Well, that's an interesting story. About an hour ago, people started arriving who weren't on the guest list. They all said the same thing, that they'd heard about your wedding and wanted to be here to support you. We had to make some quick decisions about seating, but everyone seemed so genuinely happy to be here that it felt wrong to turn them away. But how did they even know about the wedding? Apparently you've been talking about it for months. With Mrs. Rodriguez when you bought flowers. With Tom at the coffee shop. With Maria and Jerry at your office building. Word got around, and people wanted to celebrate with you. I stared at her, processing this information. People I saw in passing, people I made small talk with, people whose names I knew but who I'd never considered real friends, had heard about my wedding and decided to show up. Without invitations, without any obligation or expectation. While the people I'd considered my closest friends, the people I'd paid travel expenses for, and stressed over seating arrangements for, had all found excuses to stay away. There's more, Janet continued. Your florist, Mrs. Rodriguez, brought extra arrangements. Said she'd been working on them all week and wanted to make sure your day was as beautiful as you'd dreamed. And that young man in the navy suit. That's David's co-worker from the construction site, Miguel. He said David had been talking about you and the wedding for months, and even though he wasn't invited, he wanted to come wish you both well. David's been talking about me at work. Apparently non-stop, according to Miguel, about how excited he was, how much he loves you, how lucky he felt. Miguel said half the crew knows your favorite coffee order and your middle name just from David's story. Something was shifting inside my chest, a loosening of the tight knot of rejection that had been growing all morning. These people, these near strangers, who had become familiar faces in my daily routine, had cared enough to show up. They'd dressed in their best clothes, rearranged their Saturday plans, and come to celebrate a milestone in the life of someone who was little more than a friendly acquaintance. How many people are out there now? Janet consulted her tablet. 31. We had to bring in extra chairs from storage. 31 people. More than the 22 confirmed guests I'd been expecting after all the cancellations. I thought about the math again, but it felt different now. Instead of calculating the cost of empty seats, I was trying to figure out how many people had cared enough to show up without being asked. There's something else you should know, Janet said, her voice gentler now. Some of your canceled guests have been calling. They want to know if the live stream link is still active. Live stream. Your tech-savvy cousin set one up, remember? For elderly relatives who couldn't travel. Well, word has gotten out, and apparently there are people watching from all over. Your old college professor, some former co-workers who moved away, even some family friends who couldn't make the trip but wanted to be part of your day somehow. I had forgotten about the live stream. Rachel had set it up months ago, back when she was still planning to do a reading and be part of the ceremony. Before she'd developed mysterious food poisoning that prevented her from making the 2-hour drive. How many people are watching? The counter shows 47 viewers right now, and it's been climbing all morning. 47 people who cared enough to spend their Saturday watching me get married. People I might not have seen in years. People who could have easily ignored the link or forgotten about it. People who had no obligation to witness this moment but chose to anyway. I looked out at the garden again, and this time I saw it differently. The empty chairs weren't monuments to disappointment anymore. They were spaces that had been filled by something unexpected, something I hadn't known I needed. The people who were there weren't settling for being second-choice guests. They were celebrating because they wanted to be there. Mrs. Rodriguez caught sight of me in the window and waved, her face lighting up with genuine joy. Tom from the coffee shop gave me a thumbs up. Maria from the office building wiped her eyes with a tissue, already emotional before the ceremony had even started. These people knew me differently than Jessica or Rachel or Marcus did. They knew me as the person who always said please and thank you, who asked about their families, who remembered their birthdays and brought them cookies at Christmas. They knew me as someone who showed up consistently, who was kind without expecting anything in return, who brightened their ordinary days with genuine interest and care. Maybe that person was more real than the version of myself I'd been performing for my so-called close friends. Maybe the relationships I'd built through small daily interactions were more solid than the ones I'd tried to maintain through grand gestures and constant effort. I thought about Jessica, who I'd bent over backward to accommodate for 3 years, who I'd listened to complain about her job and her mother and her dating life for hours on end. How many times had she asked about my life? How many times had she remembered details about things that mattered to me? I thought about Rachel, who I'd assumed felt close to me because we were family, but who I realized I mostly saw at obligatory holiday gatherings where our conversations never went deeper than updates about work and complaints about traffic. I thought about Marcus, who I'd considered a good friend because we'd kept in touch after college, but whose idea of keeping in touch was liking my Instagram posts and sending the occasional meme. When was the last time we'd had a real conversation about anything that mattered? The people sitting in those white chairs, the people watching online, the florist who'd brought extra arrangements, the security guard who'd put on his best shirt, the cleaning lady who'd bought a new dress, they all knew something about love and friendship that I was just beginning to understand. Love isn't always about the people you try the hardest to impress. Sometimes it's about the people who appreciate you without you having to try at all. I turned to Janet, who had been waiting patiently while I processed this revelation. "I'm ready," I said, and for the first time all day, I meant it. We walked to the entrance of the garden, where my bouquet was waiting on a small table. As I picked it up, I could hear the string quartet beginning the processional music. Through the archway, I could see David standing at the altar in his charcoal gray suit, looking nervous and excited and absolutely perfect, but I could also see something else. The people in those chairs were all turned toward the aisle, waiting for me. Mrs. Rodriguez had her hands clasped together like she was about to witness something sacred. Tom from the coffee shop was grinning like he'd been invited to a royal wedding. Maria and Jerry were sitting together, both of them looking proud in a way that made my heart swell. I realized I wasn't walking down the aisle to a group of strangers and obligated family members. I was walking down the aisle to a community I'd accidentally built, person by person, conversation by conversation, kindness by kindness, over months and years of just being myself. The officiant, a friend of David's family, caught my eye and nodded. The music swelled. This was it. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and prepared to marry the man I loved in front of the people who had chosen to love me back. Not because they had to, not because I'd paid for their flights, or begged for their attention, but because somewhere along the way, I'd become someone worth showing up for. As I stepped into the garden and began my walk down the aisle, I saw David's face light up in a way that made every disappointment of the morning fade into background noise. He was looking at me like I was the answer to every question he'd ever had, like I was exactly where I belonged. And surrounded by the unexpected faces of people who had become my accidental family, walking toward a man who loved me without reservation, I finally felt like I was exactly where I belonged too. The empty chairs didn't matter anymore. The canceled guests, the casual rejections, the people who had found better things to do, they were all just clearing space for something better, something real, something that had been there all along, waiting for me to notice it. I was halfway down the aisle when I realized I was smiling. Not the practiced perfect smile I'd been planning to wear for the photographer, but a real smile that came from somewhere deep in my chest. The kind of smile you can't fake or force, the kind that happens when you suddenly understand something important about your own life. Mrs. Rodriguez was crying happy tears, Tom was beaming like a proud father. Maria and Jerry were holding hands like they were witnessing their own daughter getting married. Miguel, David's coworker, was nodding at me with approval and respect. These people had shown up for me without expecting anything in return. They had dressed up and rearranged their plans and brought flowers and tissues and joy simply because they wanted to celebrate someone they cared about. They had seen me as worthy of their time and attention and presence when the people I'd thought knew me best had decided I wasn't. I reached the altar, where David was waiting with tears in his eyes and love written all over his face. He took my hands, and I could feel the calluses from his construction work, the strength that had held me through difficult times, the steadiness that had never wavered even when everything else in my life felt uncertain. "You look beautiful," he whispered, loud enough for only me to hear. "I feel beautiful," I whispered back, and realized I meant it, in a way I'd never meant it before. I felt beautiful, not because of the dress, or the makeup or the flowers, but because I was surrounded by people who saw something in me worth celebrating. I felt beautiful, because I had accidentally built a life filled with kindness and connection, even when I thought I was failing at friendship. I felt beautiful, because I was about to marry a man who talked about me at work until his coworkers wanted to meet me, who made me feel chosen every single day, who had never made me wonder where I stood with him. The officiant cleared his throat, and the garden fell quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. "Dearly beloved," he began, and I looked out at the faces looking back at me. Every single person there wanted to be there. Every single person there had chosen to be part of this moment. That was when I finally understood what real family meant. It wasn't about blood relations or childhood friendships or people who felt obligated to show up. It was about people who saw you clearly and chose to stay. People who celebrated your joy because your happiness added something to their lives. People who showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. As the ceremony began, I felt a deep sense of gratitude settling over me like a warm blanket. Gratitude for the people who had canceled, because their absence had made space for something more authentic. Gratitude for the people who had shown up, because they had taught me what love actually looked like. And gratitude for this moment of clarity, when I finally understood the difference between the family you're born with, and the family you choose, and the family that chooses you right back. The vows felt different than I had imagined they would. Standing there holding David's hands, looking into his eyes while 31 people who genuinely wanted to witness this moment sat behind us, every word carried weight I hadn't expected. When David promised to love me in sickness and in health, I thought about Jerry bringing me soup when I'd had the flu last winter, even though it wasn't his job. When I promised to honor David for richer or poorer, I thought about Mrs. Rodriguez giving me a discount on flowers, during the months when my car payments were eating up my budget. These weren't just pretty words we were saying to each other, they were commitments I'd been watching lived out by people who barely knew me but had chosen to care anyway. The rings felt heavier too, like they carried the blessing of everyone present. Miguel, David's coworker, was wiping his eyes with his sleeve. Linda from the dry cleaning shop was recording everything on her phone, probably to show her own family later. The elderly couple I didn't recognize were holding hands so tightly their knuckles had gone white, like our promises were renewing their own. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the cheer that went up from our small crowd was louder than any sound I'd ever heard. It wasn't the polite applause of obligated guests, it was pure joy from people who were genuinely happy for us. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up and started clapping before anyone else, tears streaming down her cheeks. Tom from the coffee shop let out a whistle that probably echoed all the way to the parking lot. David kissed me, and for that moment, everything else disappeared. The empty chairs, the canceled guests, the months of stress and planning and disappointment. All of it dissolved into this one perfect moment, with the man I loved, surrounded by people who had proven that love comes in forms you don't always expect. When we broke apart, still holding each other, I looked out at our audience again. They were all on their feet now, applauding and cheering like we'd just won something incredible. And maybe we had, maybe we'd won something more valuable than the wedding I'd originally planned. The reception was supposed to take place in the adjoining pavilion, where I'd agonized over seating charts and centerpieces and menu options for months. Janet had somehow worked magic in the time it took us to say our vows, rearranging everything to accommodate our unexpected guest count, and make the space feel intentional rather than half-empty. But before we moved to the reception, something happened that I'll remember for the rest of my life. Mrs. Rodriguez approached us, carrying a small wrapped box tied with the same lavender ribbon I'd used on the ceremony chairs. "Sarah Mia," she said, using the endearment she'd started calling me after I'd helped her carry heavy flower arrangements to her car one day. I have something for you, we all do. She gestured to the group of people I'd started thinking of as my accidental family, and I realized they'd all gathered together while David and I were talking to the photographer. They were all holding small packages or envelopes, all wrapped in similar lavender ribbon. You didn't need to bring gifts, I started to say, but Mrs. Rodriguez held up her hand. These aren't wedding gifts, Mia, these are thank you gifts, from all of us to you. I looked at David, confused. Thank you for what? Tom from the coffee shop stepped forward, grinning. For remembering my daughter's name, for asking about her college applications, for caring about whether she got into the program she wanted. Maria joined them, her eyes bright with emotion, for staying late to help me when the elevator broke and I couldn't get my cart upstairs. For treating me like a person instead of invisible help. Jerry nodded, for asking about my grandson every single morning, for bringing me cookies when he was in the hospital, for making me feel like I mattered. Linda from the dry cleaning shop smiled, for learning enough Spanish to ask about my mother when she was sick, for bringing her soup and sitting with her when I had to work. One by one, they each shared a memory I'd forgotten or hadn't thought was significant. Small acts of kindness I'd performed without expecting anything in return, moments of connection I'd made because it felt natural, not because I was trying to build relationships or earn anything. Miguel, David's co-worker, stepped forward last, and from all of us at the construction site, for making David the happiest guy on the crew, for making him laugh every morning when he reads your texts, for making him the kind of man who talks about love like it's the best thing that ever happened to him. I was crying now, the kind of tears that come from being overwhelmed by unexpected grace. These people had seen me, really seen me, in ways that the friends I'd tried so hard to impress had never bothered to. They had noticed my character in moments when I wasn't performing or trying to prove anything. We wanted you to know, Mrs. Rodriguez said, that you have been a blessing to all of us. That the love you give every day doesn't go unnoticed. That you matter more than you know. I opened the first gift with shaking hands. It was a small photo album filled with pictures I'd never seen before. Photos of me helping Mrs. Rodriguez arrange flowers for other people's events. Pictures of me talking to Tom while I waited for my coffee, both of us laughing about something I couldn't remember. A photo of me sitting with Maria during her break, sharing a bag of chips and solving the world's problems. The next gift was a collection of letters. Handwritten notes from each person there, sharing memories and expressing gratitude for kindness I'd forgotten I'd given. Jerry had written 3 pages about how my daily conversations had helped him through his wife's death 2 years ago. Linda had written about how my attempts to speak Spanish had made her feel welcomed in a way that few customers ever did. Each gift was like this. Small, personal, meaningful in ways that expensive presents never could be. A hand-knitted scarf from the elderly couple, who turned out to be the Johnsons from the church where David's family worshipped. They'd heard about me from David's mother, and wanted to meet the woman who'd made their friend's son so happy. A playlist from Miguel and the construction crew, filled with songs that reminded them of the stories David told about me. A jar of homemade jam from someone I'd helped jump-start her car in the rain 6 months ago, who'd somehow heard about the wedding, through the network of people who'd decided I was worth celebrating. By the time I'd opened all the gifts and read all the notes, I was sobbing. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that I'd been loved all along without knowing it. That kindness given freely and without expectation had created connections deeper than friendships I'd worked years to maintain. David was crying too, reading the notes over my shoulder. "Sarah," he whispered. "Do you see what you've done? Do you see who you are?" I looked around at these people who had become my chosen family, who had shown up for me when it mattered, who had seen my heart when I thought I was invisible. I thought about Jessica and Rachel and Marcus and all the others who'd found excuses to be elsewhere, and I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was grateful. Their absence had created space for this moment. Their cancellations had cleared the way for something authentic and beautiful and real. If they had shown up, I might never have discovered what it felt like to be celebrated by people who chose to love me without obligation or expectation. The reception was unlike anything I'd planned, and so much better than anything I could have imagined. Instead of assigned seating and formal toasts and carefully choreographed events, it became an organic celebration filled with laughter and stories and dancing that lasted until the venue staff had to gently remind us about noise ordinances. Mrs. Rodriguez taught David and me a traditional dance from her childhood in Mexico. Tom shared stories about the regular customers at his coffee shop that had us all laughing until we cried. Maria and Jerry, who had apparently bonded over their shared affection for me, spent the evening comparing notes about my daily routines and habits like proud parents. The cake cutting became a community event, with everyone gathering around and shouting suggestions about the best way to avoid getting frosting on my dress. The first dance turned into a group dance when Miguel started teaching everyone steps he'd learned at his sister's quinceañera. But the moment that broke me completely came near the end of the evening, when Janet approached me with her tablet showing the livestream viewer count. "Sarah, you need to see this," she said, turning the screen toward me. The number of viewers had grown to over 300.
But more than that, the comment section was filled with messages from people I'd forgotten existed. My high school English teacher who remembered me staying after class to help organize her classroom. A former coworker who'd moved to another state but had never forgotten how I'd covered her shifts when her father was dying. College classmates who'd appreciated help with projects or kind words during difficult times. The comments kept coming, each one a small testament to interactions I'd barely remembered but that had meant something to someone else. People were sharing their own stories about me, creating a digital gathering of everyone whose life I'd touched in some small way over the years. "I wish I could be there," wrote my old college professor. "Sarah always stayed after class to help international students understand the assignments. She never made it seem like a burden. She sent me flowers when my mother died," commented someone whose name I barely recognized. "I was just an acquaintance, but she remembered and cared enough to reach out. Sarah helped me move apartments when I barely knew her," posted a former neighbor. "Spent her whole Saturday carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs and never asked for anything in return." Message after message, memory after memory, all painting a picture of someone I'd never seen clearly before. Someone who'd been building a community through small acts of service and kindness, someone who'd been loved and appreciated in ways she'd never realized. I handed the tablet back to Janet and looked around at the people still dancing and laughing in the pavilion. David was deep in conversation with Jerry about baseball statistics. Mrs. Rodriguez was showing Linda photos of her grandchildren. Tom was helping the elderly couple with their coats, making sure they had a safe ride home. This was what real family looked like. Not people bound by blood or obligation or shared history, but people bound by choice and kindness and mutual care. People who showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. People who celebrated each other's joy and supported each other's struggles without keeping score. I thought about the money I'd spent on travel expenses for people who hadn't come, the stress I'd endured trying to please people who couldn't be bothered to show up, the years I'd spent chasing friendships with people who'd never truly seen me. All of it had led to this moment, to this understanding, to this room full of people who'd taught me what love actually meant. When David and I finally left that night, covered in confetti and carrying bags full of thoughtful gifts, we walked through a receiving line of hugs and well wishes from people who'd started the day as acquaintances and ended it as family. Each person had something personal to say, some memory to share, some blessing to offer. Mrs. Rodriguez was last, and she held my hands in hers while she spoke. "Mija," she said, "you've been giving love away for years without realizing what you were building. Today you got to see what you created. This is your real family, the people who see your heart and choose to love it." As we drove away from the venue, David reached over and took my hand. "How do you feel, Mrs. Chen?" he asked, testing out my new married name. I thought about it for a moment, watching the lights of the city pass by outside our window. I felt grateful for the people who hadn't come, because their absence had made space for something better. I felt overwhelmed by the love I'd received from unexpected sources. I felt proud of the woman I'd become, without realizing I was becoming her, but mostly, I felt seen. For the first time in my life, I felt completely authentically, joyfully seen by people who mattered. "I feel like I finally understand what family means," I told him. "And I feel like the luckiest person alive." And as we drove toward our new life together, surrounded by the memory of laughter and love and authentic celebration, I realized that sometimes the best thing that can happen is discovering that the life you accidentally built is better than the one you thought you wanted. The people who were supposed to be there weren't, but the people who chose to be there changed everything. The vows we exchanged weren't the elaborate speeches I'd written and rewritten dozens of times. Standing there looking into David's eyes while surrounded by people who had surprised me with their presence, I found myself speaking from a place I hadn't expected to access on my wedding day. I told him about discovering that morning what real love looked like, how it wasn't about grand gestures or perfect planning, but about showing up consistently, about choosing someone every single day. When David spoke his vows, his voice cracked with emotion as he talked about how I'd changed his understanding of what it meant to be truly seen by another person. He mentioned how his coworkers had gotten tired of hearing about me, how he couldn't help but share stories about my kindness, my laugh, the way I remembered everyone's coffee order at the office building where I worked late nights. As he spoke, I glanced over at Miguel, who was nodding along like he'd heard these stories before. The idea that David had been so full of love for me that it spilled over into his daily conversations with people I'd never met felt like a gift I hadn't known I needed. When the officiant pronounced us married, the cheer that went up from our small crowd was so genuine and enthusiastic that it rivaled any large wedding celebration I'd ever attended. Mrs. Rodriguez was openly sobbing with joy. Tom from the coffee shop whistled so loudly that birds flew out of the nearby trees. Maria and Jerry were hugging each other like they'd just witnessed their own children getting married. But the real surprise came during the reception. As we moved from the ceremony space to the covered pavilion where dinner would be served, I noticed people I hadn't seen during the ceremony beginning to arrive. Not my canceled friends and family members, but other unexpected faces from my daily life. Dr. Patricia Nguyen, my dentist, arrived with her wife, both of them dressed elegantly and carrying a small wrapped gift. I'd been going to Dr. Nguyen for 4 years, and our conversations during cleanings and checkups had evolved from small talk into genuine connection. She knew about my engagement before I'd posted it on social media, knew about my job stress and my family dynamics, knew about my dreams of traveling to Italy someday. "Sarah, congratulations," she said, embracing me warmly. "I hope you don't mind us crashing your party." When Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned your wedding at the farmer's market this morning, Patricia and I realized we'd completely forgotten to respond to your invitation. I stared at her, confused, but I didn't send you an invitation. "Oh," she laughed, "well then I guess we're crashing in the truest sense. We just couldn't miss celebrating with you. You've been talking about this day for months during your appointments, and you've always been so interested in our lives, our anniversary, our travels. It felt wrong not to be here for your big moment." Behind Dr. Nguyen, I saw even more familiar faces. Carlos, who managed the grocery store where I shopped every week and who always asked about my wedding planning progress. Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor who I helped with her groceries and who had been following every detail of my wedding preparations with the enthusiasm of a grandmother. Even some people I barely knew but interacted with regularly had somehow heard about the celebration. The postal worker who delivered mail to my apartment building was there with his teenage daughter, both of them looking proud to be included. The barista from my second favorite coffee shop, the one I only went to when Tom's place was too crowded, had closed early to attend. I felt David's hand slip into mine as we watched this unlikely group of people mingling and laughing together, creating an energy that felt more authentic than any wedding I'd ever attended. "How did all these people even know about today?" I asked him. "You," he said simply. "You talk to everyone, you remember their names, their stories, their problems. You ask about their kids and their health and their dreams. Most people go through their daily routines invisible to each other, but you make people feel seen." I thought about this as we moved through the cocktail hour. It was true that I'd always been naturally curious about people, that I found genuine interest in the lives of the people I encountered regularly. But I'd never thought of it as anything special or significant. It was just how I moved through the world. Yet here were dozens of people who had apparently been moved enough by our brief but consistent interactions to want to celebrate one of the most important days of my life. People who had rearranged their Saturday evening plans, who had gotten dressed up, who had brought gifts and good wishes, all because they felt connected to someone they saw at the grocery store or the coffee shop or the dentist's office. When we sat down for dinner, I was amazed by the conversations happening around our small tables. Mrs. Rodriguez was deep in discussion with Dr. Nguyen about the challenges of running a small business. Carlos from the grocery store was comparing notes with Jerry about working security, while their wives bonded over stories about their adult children. Tom from the coffee shop was giving Miguel advice about the best places to buy construction supplies, and Mrs. Patterson was showing everyone photos of her granddaughter on her phone. These people who had never met each other before tonight were connecting like old friends simply because they all cared about David and me. During dinner, Janet approached our table with news that made the evening even more surprising. "Sarah, I thought you should know that the live stream has been quite active. We're up to 83 viewers now, and the comments have been incredibly sweet. Your old college professor wrote a long message about how proud she is of the person you've become. Several former coworkers have been sharing memories of working with you. Even some people I think you went to high school with have tuned in." 83 people watching online, plus the 40-something people who had shown up in person. Over 100 people who had decided that my wedding was worth their time and attention, even though most of them weren't people I would have considered close friends just that morning. I excused myself to use the restroom, and as I walked past the tables, I overheard fragments of conversations that made me understand something fundamental about the life I'd been living without fully realizing it. "Sarah always remembers that my mom is in the nursing home and asks how she's doing," Mrs. Patterson was saying to someone. "Last month she brought me soup when I had the flu, didn't even think twice about it." At another table, Carlos was telling Dr. Nguyen, "She's the only customer who knows all my employees' names." When Miguel's wife had surgery, Sarah brought flowers to the store for him. Made his whole week. Tom was explaining to David's brother Michael, "She comes in every morning before work, always orders the same thing, but she asks about my kids, remembers when they have school events." When my daughter graduated high school, Sarah brought her a card and a gift card for college supplies. Made my daughter feel like she had this whole community cheering for her. I stood in the hallway outside the restroom, overwhelmed by these revelations about my own life. I had been living in a way that created connection and community without consciously trying to do so. While I'd been focused on maintaining relationships with people who apparently saw me as optional, I'd been unconsciously building a network of people who saw me as essential to their daily experience of kindness and human connection. When I returned to the reception, the sun was setting and someone had strung lights between the trees that cast everything in a warm golden glow. David pulled me onto the small dance floor for our first dance, and as we swayed to the music, I could see all these unexpected guests watching us with genuine joy. "I keep thinking about the money," I admitted to David as we danced. "All the flights I paid for, the hotel rooms, the meals that went uneaten, I was so focused on what this day was costing me that I almost missed what it was giving me." "What's it giving you?" he asked, spinning me gently. "Clarity," I said, "about what matters. About who really sees me. About the difference between people who show up because they have to, and people who show up because they want to." As if summoned by our conversation, my phone buzzed in the small purse I'd carried down the aisle. I ignored it, but it buzzed again and again. David noticed my distraction and suggested I check it quickly. The messages were from Jessica, my former maid of honor. "Sarah, I saw on Instagram that your wedding was today. I'm so sorry I couldn't make it. Emergency with my mom turned out to be nothing serious. Hope it was beautiful." Another message from Rachel, "Just saw your wedding photos online. Looked lovely, sorry about the food poisoning. Let's catch up soon, and Marcus, congrats on the wedding. Saw the live stream link but was busy today. I'm sure it was amazing." I stared at these messages, trying to process the casual tone, the complete lack of awareness about what their absence had meant to me, the assumption that I would understand and forgive and probably make efforts to maintain our friendships, despite their letting me down when it mattered most. A year ago, or even that morning, I would have responded immediately with reassurance that I understood, that emergencies happen, that we should definitely catch up soon. I would have prioritized their comfort over my own hurt feelings, would have minimized my disappointment to make them feel better about their choices.
But standing there, surrounded by people who had chosen to celebrate with me, I felt different. I felt worthy of better treatment. I felt deserving of friends who showed up when it mattered, who didn't casually dismiss my important moments, who put in effort that matched what I gave to them. I turned my phone off without responding and slipped it back into my purse. "Everything okay?" David asked. "Everything's perfect," I said, and meant it completely. The rest of the evening unfolded like a fairy tale I hadn't known I was living. Mrs. Rodriguez had indeed brought extra floral arrangements, and the pavilion looked like something from a magazine. The photographer, initially concerned about the small crowd, ended up taking some of the most beautiful candid shots I'd ever seen, capturing genuine moments of joy and connection that no amount of staging could have created. During the toasts, Dr. Nguyen stood up and spoke about the importance of people who bring light into ordinary moments. Carlos talked about how kindness was a choice that some people made consistently and how rare and valuable that was. Tom, who admitted he'd never given a speech before, simply said that some people made the world feel like a friendlier place just by being in it. But the most surprising moment came when Miguel, David's coworker, asked for the microphone. "I know I wasn't supposed to be here tonight," he began, his accent thick with emotion, "but David talks about Sarah so much that I felt like I knew her before I ever met her. He told us about how she brings coffee to the security guard at her building, how she always asks the cleaning lady about her grandchildren, how she helped her neighbor with groceries during the pandemic without being asked." He looked directly at me. "David said he knew he wanted to marry you the day you spent your lunch break helping an elderly man who'd fallen outside your office building. You stayed with him until the ambulance came, missed your meeting, got in trouble with your boss, but you said it was the only thing you could have done. That's when David knew you were someone who understood what love actually looks like." I had forgotten about that day, forgotten that I'd told David about it, forgotten that he'd apparently shared the story with people I'd never met. But hearing it reflected back to me in front of all these people who had shown up to celebrate, I finally understood something important about my own character. I wasn't someone who had failed at friendship with Jessica and Rachel and Marcus. I was someone who had different values around friendship than they did. I believed in showing up in consistent care, in making people feel valued and seen. They apparently believed in convenience, in fair weather support, in relationships that didn't require much effort or sacrifice. Neither approach was wrong, exactly, but they were incompatible. I had been trying to maintain relationships with people who fundamentally approached connection differently than I did, and I had been measuring my worth by their standards instead of my own. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, each person made a point of hugging me goodbye and expressing how happy they were to have been included. Mrs. Rodriguez pressed a small wrapped gift into my hands, saying it was something for my new home. Dr. Nguyen and her wife invited David and me to dinner the following weekend. Carlos asked if we needed help moving any of our wedding gifts, insisting that he had a truck and would be happy to help. These people, who had started the day as friendly acquaintances, were leaving as something much deeper. They had become my chosen family, the people who had seen something in me worth celebrating, and who had acted on that instinct without expectation of reciprocation. As David and I said goodbye to the last guests, I realized that this day had given me something I'd never expected to receive. Not just a wedding, not just a celebration, but a completely new understanding of my own worth and the relationships that actually mattered in my life. The empty chairs from the morning, the canceled guests, the casual rejections, they had all cleared space for something authentic and meaningful. They had forced me to see that I had been looking for validation in all the wrong places, seeking approval from people who weren't capable of giving me the kind of love I deserved. Later that night, as David and I sat on our hotel room balcony looking at our wedding photos, I finally responded to the messages from Jessica, Rachel, and Marcus. I kept it simple. "Thank you for reaching out. I hope you're all well. I've realized that my expectations for friendship might be different from yours, and I think it's healthier for everyone if we give each other some space." I didn't explain or justify or try to make them understand what they'd cost me. I didn't leave room for negotiation or promises to do better next time. I simply acknowledged the reality of our different approaches to relationships and chose to protect my own peace, instead of managing their comfort. Then I turned my phone off again, and focused on my husband, who was looking through photos of our perfect, imperfect, completely unexpected wedding day with tears of joy in his eyes. "Thank you," I said to him. "For what?" For talking about me at work until your coworkers wanted to meet me. For seeing something in me worth celebrating. For being exactly the kind of person who shows up when it matters. He kissed me, and I tasted the salt of happy tears, and the sweetness of a life I was finally ready to embrace exactly as it was, surrounded by people who had chosen to love me without conditions or expectations. The venue was empty now, except for the cleanup crew and the lingering scent of Mrs. Rodriguez's flowers, but the love that had filled those chairs, the joy that had made the evening sparkle, the connections that had been strengthened and celebrated, all of that was coming home with us. I had set out to have a perfect wedding surrounded by all the important people in my life. Instead, I discovered who the important people actually were, and learned that love looks different than I'd thought it did. It looks like showing up without being asked, like celebrating without expecting anything in return, like choosing someone not because you have to, but because their happiness adds something irreplaceable to your own life. As we finally headed to bed, I felt grateful for every canceled guest, every empty chair, every disappointment that had led me to this moment of perfect clarity about what real love actually looks like. 6 months later, I was standing in line at Tom's coffee shop on a Tuesday morning when I overheard a conversation that made me smile. A woman behind me was telling her friend about a wedding she'd attended where the bride had been abandoned by all her original guests, only to discover that her real community had been there all along. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, she was saying. All these people who barely knew her, but who loved her anyway, just showed up. Made me think about my own relationships, like who would actually be there for me if everything fell apart. I didn't turn around to identify the speaker, but I felt a warm satisfaction knowing that our story had somehow made its way into the world, inspiring other people to think about the quality of their connections. David and I had never intended for our wedding to become a talking point, but apparently the live stream and social media posts had struck a chord with people who recognized something universal in what we'd experienced. The changes in my life since that day had been gradual but profound. I'd stopped making excuses for people who consistently let me down, stopped overextending myself for relationships that weren't reciprocal, stopped measuring my worth by how much effort I could put into maintaining connections with people who didn't match that energy. Instead, I'd leaned into the relationships that had revealed themselves to be genuine. Mrs. Rodriguez and I had started having monthly dinners, sharing stories about our families and dreams that went deeper than our previous flower shop conversations. Dr. Nuchin and her wife had become regular fixtures in our social life, introducing us to their circle of friends, and creating a network of people who valued authenticity over performance. Maria from the office building had become one of my closest confidants. We'd discovered that our late-night coffee conversations had been meaningful to both of us, and we'd started meeting for lunch regularly to continue talks that had been interrupted by cleaning schedules and work demands. Even Miguel, David's coworker who had crashed our wedding, had become a genuine friend. His family had invited us to birthday parties and barbecues, and I'd learned that his intuition about people was remarkable. He'd seen something in our love story that had made him want to be part of it, and his presence in our lives had enriched both our marriage and our understanding of how family can be chosen rather than assigned. The most surprising development had been with my actual family. My parents, who had initially been mortified by the wedding day chaos and the online attention it had generated, had gradually come to understand what I'd discovered about authentic relationships. My mother had started asking different questions about my friendships, paying attention to who actually supported me rather than who I spent the most time trying to please. "I never realized how much you were giving to people who weren't giving back," she'd said, during one of our phone calls. "I think I taught you that love meant accepting whatever treatment people offered, but maybe I was wrong about that." My father had been even more direct. "Those people who didn't show up, they did you a favor, now you know who they really are, and you can stop wasting your energy on them." It had taken months for me to fully internalize this lesson. I'd grown up believing that being a good friend meant being endlessly accommodating, always available, consistently willing to prioritize other people's needs over my own. I'd thought that love required sacrifice, and that the amount of effort I put into a relationship was a measure of its importance. But the people who had shown up to my wedding had taught me that real love doesn't require you to diminish yourself. Mrs. Rodriguez didn't love me because I bent over backward to please her. She loved me because our interactions were genuine and mutually respectful.
Tom didn't value our friendship because I performed some version of myself designed to win his approval. He valued it because I was consistently kind without expecting anything in return. The wedding had been a mirror that showed me the difference between performative relationships and authentic ones. The people who canceled had been participating in a version of friendship that was based on convenience and obligation. The people who showed up had been participating in a version of community that was based on genuine care and voluntary connection. This realization had changed how I approached new relationships as well. Instead of immediately trying to prove my worth through grand gestures or excessive availability, I allowed connections to develop naturally. I paid attention to reciprocity, to consistency, to the ways people treated me when it wasn't convenient for them to be kind. David and I had started hosting monthly dinners for our chosen family, rotating between our apartment and the homes of our friends. These gatherings had become the highlight of our social calendar, filled with conversations that mattered and laughter that felt earned rather than performed. At our 6-month anniversary celebration, Mrs. Rodriguez had stood up to make a toast that brought tears to my eyes. "Sarah taught me that family isn't just about blood or legal documents," she'd said. "It's about people who see the best in each other and choose to nurture that goodness." 6 months ago, I was just someone who sold her flowers. Now I can't imagine my life without her friendship. That sentiment had been echoed by everyone around our dinner table. We'd all started as strangers or acquaintances, but we'd become something deeper by choosing each other deliberately and consistently. The contrast with my former friendships couldn't have been starker. Jessica had reached out a few more times over the months, with casual invitations that felt designed to test whether I'd gotten over being hurt. Each time I'd politely declined, explaining that I was focusing my energy on relationships that felt more balanced. Rachel had sent a birthday card with a note about how we should get past this silly misunderstanding and be family again. I'd realized that she genuinely didn't understand that missing my wedding wasn't a misunderstanding but a revelation about her priorities. Marcus had stopped reaching out altogether after I didn't respond enthusiastically to his occasional memes and tagged photos. Apparently, without my consistent effort to maintain our connection, there wasn't enough substance there to survive. I felt no anger toward any of them anymore, just a clear-eyed understanding that we'd been incompatible in ways I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. They weren't bad people, they just approached relationships differently than I did. But recognizing that incompatibility had freed me to invest in connections that actually nourished me. The most unexpected consequence of my wedding day revelation had been professional. Word had spread at my office about the marketing manager who'd accidentally discovered her real community, and colleagues had started seeking my advice about their own relationship challenges. I'd realized that my ability to build authentic connections was actually a valuable skill, one that could be applied to client relationships and team building. My boss had noticed the change in my work performance, the confidence that came from feeling genuinely valued by the people who mattered to me. I'd been promoted to senior manager and given responsibility for client retention, a role that utilized my natural ability to make people feel seen and appreciated. "You've always been good at your job," my boss had told me during my performance review. "But lately you seem more focused, more sure of yourself. Whatever you're doing in your personal life, it's making you a better professional too." I'd smiled, thinking about how learning to value myself appropriately in friendships had naturally extended to valuing myself appropriately at work. When you stop accepting crumbs in one area of your life, you tend to stop accepting them everywhere. As I collected my coffee from Tom that Tuesday morning, he handed me an extra pastry with my usual order. "For the road," he said with a grin. "Maria mentioned you've got a big presentation today." This small gesture, the fact that 2 people in my chosen family had been talking about my work life and coordinating to support me, felt more meaningful than any grand gesture my former friends had ever made. It was the kind of care that happened naturally when people genuinely valued each other's well-being. Walking to work, I thought about the question the woman in line had posed to her friend, who would actually be there for me if everything fell apart. A year ago I would have confidently listed Jessica, Rachel, Marcus, and several other people who had ultimately proven unreliable when it mattered most. Now I could list Mrs. Rodriguez, Tom, Maria, Dr. Na, and Carlos, Miguel, and a dozen other people who had demonstrated their care through actions rather than words. People who remembered my important days, who checked on me when I was stressed, who celebrated my victories and supported me through challenges without being asked.
The difference wasn't just in the reliability of these relationships, but in how they made me feel about myself. Instead of constantly wondering if I was doing enough to earn people's affection, I felt secure in the knowledge that I was valued for who I actually was. My wedding day had taught me that sometimes the most devastating disappointments are actually the most liberating revelations. Sometimes having your expectations completely shattered allows you to see reality clearly for the first time. Sometimes losing the relationships you thought you wanted creates space for the relationships you actually need. I arrived at the office building where Maria was just starting her morning routine, and she waved from across the lobby with genuine warmth. Jerry, the security guard, asked about David's latest construction project, remembering details from conversations we'd had weeks ago. These people, who had once been pleasant background figures in my daily routine, had become anchors of stability and care in my life. That evening, David and I sat on our couch looking through wedding photos on our first anniversary planning committee meeting. We were already discussing our first anniversary celebration, trying to decide whether to have an intimate dinner with just our chosen family, or a larger party that would include some of the people who had discovered our story online and wanted to be part of our continued journey. "What do you think about inviting some of the livestream viewers?" David asked. "Some of them have become regular commenters on your social media, and they seem genuinely invested in our happiness." I considered this, thinking about how our accidental community had continued to grow even after the wedding. People had reached out to share their own stories of discovering who their real friends were, of learning to value themselves enough to expect better treatment, of finding family in unexpected places. "I think," I said slowly, "that we should trust the same instinct that made our wedding day so perfect. Let's invite the people who feel genuinely connected to our story, whether we've known them for years or just met them online. Let's celebrate with people who choose to be there, not people who feel obligated." David smiled, and I could see in his expression the same understanding that had been growing in both of us since our wedding day. Love wasn't about quantity or history or performance. It was about choice, consistency, and the willingness to show up for each other's joy, as well as each other's struggles. Our wedding had been perfect, not because everything went according to plan, but because it had revealed the true nature of love in our lives. The empty chairs had made space for full hearts. The canceled guests had cleared room for authentic community. The disappointment had transformed into the most beautiful kind of clarity. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt grateful for every person who had let me down, because their absence had taught me to recognize and value the people who lift me up. I felt grateful for every relationship that had ended, because it had made room for relationships that were just beginning. Most of all, I felt grateful for learning that real family isn't about who's supposed to love you, but about who chooses to love you, again and again, in all the small moments that make up a life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.